Don't walk away from me. Please, Alexander Hayes said, his voice low and unsteady, fingers tightening around Grace Miller's wrist as if letting go would cost him everything. A moment so unthinkable that anyone who knew the billionaire would have sworn it was impossible just days ago. Because 3 days earlier Alexander Hayes didn't beg, he didn't hesitate, and he definitely didn't notice someone like Grace, a quiet pool attendant working 12-hour shifts under the blazing California sun at his $15 million Beverly Hills estate, where every detail screamed perfection except for the way people like her blended into the background, invisible unless something went wrong. And that afternoon, everything had gone perfectly for him. Champagne glasses clinking, luxury cars lining the driveway, investors and influencers laughing under white cabanas, the kind of party where status wasn't just shown. It was measured, and Alexander stood at the center of it all, confident, untouchable. The kind of man who built his empire from nothing and never let anyone forget it. Especially not someone like Grace, who moved quietly between guests, skimming leaves from the infinity pool, adjusting towels, making sure no one had a reason to complain, because complaints meant losing the job she couldn't afford to lose, not with bills stacking up and a life depending on her staying strong. And for a while she managed to stay unnoticed until one careless moment shifted everything. A tray, slipping slightly in her hand as a guest brushed past too quickly, a glass tipping, not shattering, not causing real damage, but enough to draw attention, and attention in Alexander's world was never gentle. His eyes locking onto her instantly, sharp and assessing, the laughter around him dimming just enough for his voice to cut through, calm but cold, asking her name as if it actually mattered, and when she answered, Grace, there was a pause, the kind that made people lean in, followed by a smirk that told everyone exactly what was coming next, because Alexander Hayes didn't miss opportunities to entertain his guests, especially when it came at someone else's expense, and with a casual gesture, he called her closer, turning what should have been a small mistake into a spectacle, his tone light, but laced with mockery as he commented on how ironic her name was, how someone named Grace could be so clumsy, the guests chuckling, some uncomfortable, others amused, and Grace stood there, shoulders tight, forcing herself to remain calm, because reacting would only make it worse, because she had learned that silence was sometimes the only shield she had. But Alexander wasn't finished, not even close, because to him this wasn't cruelty. It was control, it was power, and power meant deciding who mattered and who didn't. And in that moment he decided she didn't, not enough to be treated with dignity, not enough to be left alone. And as the laughter grew, so did the distance between who he thought he was and what he was about to become, because none of them knew, not the guests, not Alexander, not even Grace herself, that this small, humiliating moment was the beginning of something none of them could control, something that would flip every assumption in that perfect backyard, something that would force a man who had everything to face the one thing he never learned how to handle, and standing there under the California sun, with chlorine in the air and judgment in every glance, Grace lowered her eyes just long enough to hide the shift in them, because what Alexander saw as weakness was something else entirely, something he would soon understand, just not today. The laughter did not fade right away. It lingered like a stain in the air, and Alexander Hayes leaned into it, lifting his glass slightly, as if he had just delivered the perfect line, his confidence feeding off the approval around him while Grace stood there, still holding the tray, her fingers steady now even though her chest felt tight, and for a second it seemed like the moment would pass, like she would quietly step away and disappear back into the rhythm of work, but Alexander was not finished because attention was something he controlled, and he was not ready to let it go, not when every eye was still on him. And with a casual tone that felt almost playful, he asked her a question that made the nearby guests turn even more, asking if she had ever imagined what it would be like to marry into a place like this, his hand gesturing toward the mansion, the cars, the view stretching across Beverly Hills, and before she could respond, before she could even decide if answering was safe, he continued, saying that maybe they should give everyone a show, maybe they should pretend, just for a second, that the pool girl could be the bride, the words landing like a joke that everyone understood except the person it was about. And a few people laughed louder, others exchanged glances, but no one stepped in, because no one challenged Alexander Hayes in his own house. and Grace felt the heat rise to her face, not from the sun, but from the weight of being watched, judged, turned into something she never agreed to be, and still she said nothing, because experience had taught her that reacting would only stretch the moment, would give him more to play with, and for a brief second it seemed like her silence might end it. But then someone in the crowd encouraged him, a voice calling out for him to go on, to make it official, and that was all it took, because Alexander thrived on escalation, on turning small moments into something bigger, something memorable, and with a half-smile he reached for a decorative ring sitting on a nearby table, something meant for display, nothing valuable, but enough to sell the illusion. And he stepped closer to her, holding it up just enough for everyone to see, asking her, in a tone that blurred the line between humor and command, if she would do him the honor, the words sounding like a proposal but carrying none of the respect, and the crowd leaned in, waiting, watching how she would respond, because now it was not just about him. It was about her reaction, her place in the moment, and Grace felt the world narrow, the noise fading into a distant hum as she looked at the ring, then at him, then at the faces around them, realizing that no answer would truly protect her, because saying yes would feed the joke and saying no would challenge the man who controlled her job. And in that split second, she made a choice not out of fear, but out of control. A quiet kind of control that no one else noticed, and she gave a small nod, just enough to satisfy the moment without giving it more than it deserved, and the crowd reacted instantly. Laughter, applause, phones lifting to capture the scene, while Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with exaggerated care, playing into the performance, declaring it done as if he had just created something meaningful instead of tearing something down. And then just as quickly as it began, he stepped back, already losing interest, already moving on to the next conversation, the next deal, the next moment that actually mattered to him, leaving Grace standing there with a ring that meant nothing and a room full of people who would forget her by tomorrow. Except something had shifted, something subtle but real, because as she removed the ring and placed it back on the table, her expression changed in a way no one noticed, not even Alexander, a quiet steadiness replacing the tension, like she had already stepped beyond this moment while everyone else was still trapped inside it. And as the party continued and the music picked back up, no one realized that what they had just witnessed was not the peak of the story, but the beginning of a reversal none of them were prepared for, least of all the man who believed he was always in control. By the time the sun dipped lower over the hills and the golden light stretched across the water, the party had fully moved on, conversations shifting to investments, vacations, and opportunities that existed far above the world Grace lived in, and to most of them, she had already disappeared, just another worker blending into the background. But for Grace the moment lingered, not as humiliation anymore, but as something sharper, something clearer, like a line had been drawn that she could now see. With perfect focus, and instead of breaking her, it steadied her, because she had seen this before in different forms, different places, people with power assuming they understood everything simply because no one challenged them. And as she continued working, collecting empty glasses, adjusting chairs, keeping the space flawless, her movements were calm, controlled, almost detached, while across the yard Alexander Hayes laughed with a group of investors, already deep into a conversation about expansion, numbers, and future deals, his world moving at a pace where people like Grace were not meant to exist beyond utility. And yet something about the earlier moment stayed with him longer than he expected, not enough to concern him, not enough to question himself, but enough to create a faint irritation he could not immediately explain, like something had not resolved the way it usually did, and he dismissed it quickly because there were more important things to focus on, until the evening took a subtle turn that no one saw coming. It started small, a shift in the atmosphere, the music lowering slightly as a staff member rushed quietly through the side of the patio, whispering to another, their expressions tight, controlled but urgent, the kind of tension that does not belong in a place built on perfection, and Grace noticed it instantly, because she had trained herself to notice things others ignored, small details that signaled when something was about to go wrong. And while the guests remained unaware, still laughing, still enjoying the night, she adjusted her path, moving closer to where the staff gathered, her attention sharpening as she listened without appearing to listen, catching fragments of concern, something about a sudden issue, something that required immediate attention, and across the yard Alexander's conversation slowed as one of his assistants approached him carefully, speaking low enough to keep it private, but not fast enough to hide the urgency. And for the first time that evening his expression shifted, just slightly, the confidence still there, but now mixed with calculation, as if he was quickly assessing whether this was something minor or something that could disrupt the image he had built so carefully. And without drawing attention, he excused himself, stepping away from the center of the party toward the quieter edge of the property, where the lights were softer and the noise faded just enough for reality to slip in. And Grace watched this without staring, her instincts telling her that whatever was unfolding was not just another small inconvenience, because the people who worked closely with him did not move like that unless it mattered. And for a brief moment she hesitated, not out of fear but out of awareness, because stepping into something unknown always came with a cost, and yet something in her did not allow her to ignore it, not after everything that had happened, not after the way the night had shifted. And as the distance between the celebration and the quiet tension grew, Grace made a decision that no one noticed, setting down what she was carrying and moving in the same direction, not to follow him, not to intrude, but because deep down she understood something that Alexander did not. That control is often an illusion, and when it breaks, it does not ask for permission. And as she stepped into the softer light beyond the main patio, the air felt different, heavier, like the moment before something changes, and neither of them realized yet that the balance between them was already beginning to shift. Alexander Hayes stepped into the quieter corridor just beyond the glass doors, the noise of the party fading behind him as his assistant spoke quickly, outlining a situation that was not supposed to happen tonight. Not here, not in front of people who expected perfection. And although the details came in fragments, the meaning was clear enough to tighten his focus. Something had gone wrong in a way that could not be ignored. And for a man who built his reputation on control, even a small disruption carried weight, his expression sharpening as he asked precise questions, each one aimed at regaining command of a situation that was slipping just outside his reach. And a few feet away, Grace slowed her steps, not close enough to intrude, but near enough to sense the shift in energy. The confidence that had defined Alexander earlier now edged with something more urgent, something less certain, and she recognized it immediately. Not because she knew his world, but because she understood. Pressure, the kind that builds quietly before it forces decisions. And while his assistant continued speaking, another staff member approached from the opposite direction, their tone even more tense, adding new information that complicated things further. And for the first time that night, Alexander paused longer than usual, not speaking right away, his mind clearly recalculating, because whatever this was, it was not following the predictable path he relied on. And in that brief silence, the distance between who he appeared to be and what he was dealing with became visible, even if only for a second. And Grace saw it, not with judgment, but with clarity. The same clarity that had kept her steady through moments others might panic in. And without fully deciding to, she took a few steps closer, her presence still quiet, but now within range of the conversation. And one phrase stood out, something about timing, something about needing immediate action before the situation affected more than just the private side of the estate. And while the assistant suggested options that sounded cautious and delayed, Grace felt a different answer form in her mind. One shaped by experience that did not come from wealth or status, but from dealing with real problems in real time. And for a moment she hesitated again, because speaking up here would cross a line that had been made very clear earlier, a line reinforced by the way she had been treated in front of everyone. And yet the situation unfolding did not leave much room for hesitation, because she understood something they did not. That waiting would only make it harder to control, and before she could overthink it, she spoke, her voice calm but firm enough to be heard, offering a simple observation that cut through the noise of the discussion, suggesting a direct approach that addressed the urgency instead of avoiding it. And the effect was immediate, both men turning toward her, surprised not just by what she said, but by the fact that she said anything at all. And for a split second the old dynamic returned. The expectation that she would step back, apologize, disappear, but she did not move. She held her position with a quiet confidence that did not challenge them aggressively, but did not retreat either. And Alexander studied her, not with the dismissive glance from earlier, but with a sharper attention, as if trying to place something that did not match his previous assumptions. And in that moment, the noise of the party felt very far away, replaced by a different kind of tension, one built on uncertainty instead of control. And although he did not fully trust the interruption, he could not ignore the logic in what she said, because it aligned with the urgency he was already feeling. And after a brief pause that stretched longer than expected, he made a decision, not an admission of being wrong, but a calculated choice to act, instructing his assistant to follow through with the suggestion, his tone controlled, but now carrying a hint of something new, something closer to reliance than authority. And as the staff moved quickly to respond, the dynamic between them shifted again, subtly but unmistakably, because for the first time that night Grace was no longer invisible. And for the first time Alexander Hayes had to acknowledge that someone he had dismissed might understand something he did not. And as the situation began to unfold in a new direction, neither of them fully realized that this small moment of recognition was about to change everything that came next. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and once it began it did not stop, because the moment Alexander Hayes allowed Grace's suggestion to guide his decision, the situation started moving in a direction no one else had anticipated, his assistant quickly relaying instructions while others adjusted their roles without question, the quiet urgency replacing earlier hesitation. And within minutes the tension that had been building began to ease, not completely, but enough to signal that control was returning, and Alexander watched it happen with a level of focus that went beyond the problem itself, because now there was something else in the equation, something he had not accounted for, and that was her, standing just a few feet away, no longer speaking, no longer inserting herself, but not retreating either, her presence calm and steady as if she had always known this would work. And for the first time that evening he looked at her without the filter of status, without the assumptions that had defined their earlier interaction, and what he saw did not match what he expected, because there was no nervousness, no need for approval, only a quiet certainty that made him pause longer than he intended. And it was not admiration yet, not respect in the way he gave it to people in his world, but it was something close to recognition, the kind that makes you question your first judgment without fully admitting it. And as the staff confirmed that the situation was stabilizing, his assistant turned back to him with a nod, the kind that meant the immediate risk had been handled. And just like that, the pressure that had pulled him away from the party began to lift. But instead of returning right away, Alexander stayed where he was, his attention still on Grace, as if leaving now would mean missing something important, something he could not quite define. And she noticed it. Of course she did, because she noticed everything. But she did not react to it. She simply waited, giving him the space to process what had just happened without pushing for acknowledgement, because she did not need it, not in the way he was used to people needing his approval. And that difference unsettled him more than he expected, because in his world value was always exchanged, always recognized, always rewarded. But here there was none of that, just a quiet moment where the usual rules did not seem to apply. And after a few seconds that felt longer than they should, he finally spoke, not with the sharp authority from earlier, but with a more measured tone, asking her how she knew what to do. A simple question on the surface, but carrying more weight underneath. And Grace answered just as simply, explaining that sometimes problems are easier to solve when you stop looking at them from the top and start looking at them from the ground. Her words not dramatic, not meant to impress, but grounded in a perspective he rarely considered. And for a moment he did not respond, because the answer was not something he could immediately categorize. It did not fit into his usual frameworks of expertise or experience, and yet it made sense in a way that was difficult to ignore. And as the sounds of the party drifted back into the space, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, it became clear that the world he controlled was still waiting for him, still expecting him to return unchanged. But something had already shifted, even if only slightly. And as he straightened his posture and prepared to step back into that world, he glanced at Grace one more time, this time not as a distraction or an inconvenience, but as a variable he had not fully understood. And without saying anything further he turned and walked back toward the light, the energy of the party rising to meet him, while behind him Grace remained still for a second longer before quietly returning to her work, the distance between them restored on the surface, but no longer the same beneath it, because what had just happened could not be undone, and whether he admitted it or not, Alexander Hayes had just relied on someone he once believed did not matter. And that realization, however small, was the beginning of something he would not be able to control for much longer. When Alexander Hayes stepped back into the glow of the party, everything looked exactly the same. The music flowing smoothly, guests laughing under warm lights, conversations picking up without interruption, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. And that was the point, because in his world problems were not allowed to exist in public, they were handled quietly, efficiently, and erased before they could leave a mark. And yet as he moved through the crowd, acknowledging greetings, responding with practiced confidence, something felt different, not in the environment, but in the way he processed it. Like there was now a layer beneath the surface he could not ignore, and more than once his attention drifted back toward the pool area, where Grace had already returned to her routine, blending into the background again, as if the previous moment had never happened. But for him it had not disappeared. It lingered in a way that did not match the usual rhythm of his thoughts, and a few of his guests noticed the shift, subtle as it was, asking if everything was all right, if something had come up, and he answered easily, reassuring them with the same calm authority that had built his reputation. But even as he spoke, part of his focus remained elsewhere, replaying what had happened, not the problem itself but the way it had been solved, the simplicity of it, the clarity that had cut through the noise his own team had created, and it unsettled him in a way he could not openly acknowledge, because it challenged something fundamental. The idea that control came from being above the situation, when what he had just seen suggested otherwise. And as the evening continued, the energy of the party began to wind down, guests gradually leaving, the music softening, the lights dimming slightly as the staff shifted into closing routines, and Alexander found himself stepping away from the remaining conversations earlier than usual, moving again toward the quieter edge of the property, not because there was another issue, but because his mind had not settled. And as he approached the pool, he saw Grace finishing her tasks, carefully organizing the last of the equipment, her movements steady despite the long hours. And for a moment he simply watched, something he would not have done before, observing the consistency, the focus, the absence of any need for recognition. And when she turned and noticed him, there was no surprise in her expression, no tension, just a calm acknowledgement that he was there, and the silence between them stretched for a second before he spoke, this time without an audience, without the pressure to perform, asking her why she stayed so calm earlier, not just during the situation but during everything that came before it, the question carrying more weight than he intended. And Grace considered it briefly before answering, explaining that when you expect people to underestimate you, you learn to rely on yourself instead of their opinions, her voice even, not defensive, not emotional, just stating something she had already accepted. And that answer stayed with him longer than anything else she had said, because it revealed something he had not considered, that her silence earlier was not weakness but choice, a decision to hold control in a different way. And as the last of the staff began to leave, the space around them grew quieter, the contrast between the earlier chaos and the current stillness making everything feel more defined. And Alexander realized that the version of her he had created in his mind did not match the reality standing in front of him. And for the first time, he did not try to correct that immediately. He simply stood there, processing, while Grace picked up her bag, preparing to leave without waiting for anything from him. And as she walked past, he almost said something else, something that might have changed the direction of the moment. But he stopped himself, not out of pride, but because he did not yet understand what he would be responding to. And as she continued toward the exit, disappearing beyond the soft lights of the property, Alexander remained where he was, aware that something had shifted in a way he could not fully define, something that would not stay contained within this one evening. Because for the first time in a long time, he had encountered someone who did not fit into his system of control, and that realization was not going to leave as easily as the guests had. The next morning did not feel the same to Alexander Hayes. Even though everything followed the exact routine that had defined his success for years, the early calls, the structured meetings, the constant flow of decisions that usually left no room for distraction, and yet something from the night before remained, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent in a way that made it impossible to ignore. because every time he moved through a conversation or reviewed a report, there was a quiet comparison happening in the back of his mind, a contrast between the complex systems he relied on and the simple clarity Grace had brought into a moment that should have required far more effort to resolve, and it disrupted his rhythm just enough to make him aware of it. And awareness was not something he allowed lightly, especially when it came from a source he had dismissed so completely. And as the morning progressed, he found himself asking questions he normally would not ask, requesting details from his team that went beyond surface level, pushing for explanations that tested their understanding rather than just their execution. And while they responded with the same efficiency they always had, it no longer felt as complete as it once did, as if something was missing, something he had only just recognized the night before. And by the time his final meeting ended, the decision had already formed, not fully articulated but clear enough to act on. And instead of moving on to the next scheduled item, he changed direction, instructing his driver to take him back to the estate earlier than planned, the choice surprising even himself because it broke the pattern he had built so carefully. And when he arrived, the property was quiet, the remnants of the previous night already cleaned away, the space returned to its perfect, controlled state. But the memory of what had happened there still lingered for him, and without hesitation he asked the head of staff about Grace, keeping his tone neutral, as if it were a routine inquiry, and the answer came with a slight pause, a detail he had not expected. She was not scheduled to be there that day. Her shifts rotated, her time divided between multiple properties, a system designed for efficiency, but one that suddenly felt inconvenient. And for a moment he considered leaving it there, returning to his usual priorities, but the thought did not settle, because now that he had seen something different, he could not simply go back to ignoring it. And instead he asked for more information, where she worked next, what her schedule looked like, details that would have seemed unnecessary before, but now felt essential. And as the staff member provided what they knew, he realized how little he had actually understood about the people who kept his world running, how easily he had categorized them without ever looking closer. And that realization carried a weight he did not immediately process, because it challenged more than just a single interaction. It questioned a pattern that had shaped the way he saw everything. And as he stood there in the quiet space of his own estate, Alexander Hayes made a decision that was not driven by strategy or profit or expectation, but by something far less familiar. Curiosity mixed with a need to understand. And it was that decision that led him to change the rest of his day, redirecting his time toward finding someone he once believed did not matter, not because he needed her in the way he needed his executives or his partners, but because something about her had already shifted the way he saw control, and he could not ignore that any longer. And somewhere across the city, completely unaware of the direction his thoughts had taken, Grace moved through her own day with the same steady focus, not expecting anything to change, not anticipating that the distance between their worlds was already beginning to close in a way neither of them could stop. By the time Alexander Hayes arrived at the second property listed in Grace's schedule, the sun had shifted high above the city, casting sharp light across a smaller, but equally pristine estate tucked into a quiet neighborhood miles away from the one he called home. And the contrast was immediate, not in quality, but in atmosphere, because this place did not carry the same weight of performance. It felt more contained, more functional, a space where work happened without the constant pressure of being seen. And as he stepped out of the car, the staff on site reacted with subtle confusion, clearly not expecting him there, their movements tightening as they tried to adjust to his presence without disrupting their routine. And he acknowledged them briefly, his attention already scanning the area until he found her near the far side of the pool, moving with the same steady rhythm he had seen before, focused, efficient, completely unaware that he was standing there watching. And for a moment he did not approach, he simply observed, noticing details he had missed before, the way she organized her tasks without hesitation, the way she anticipated what needed to be done next without being told, the absence of any wasted motion. And it reinforced something he had begun to understand, that her clarity was not accidental, it was built, shaped by repetition and necessity. And when she finally looked up and saw him, there was a brief pause, not shock, not discomfort, just recognition followed by a quiet question in her expression, as if she was waiting to understand why he was there. And this time there was no audience, no performance, no pressure to maintain an image, just two people standing in a space that did not belong to either of their usual worlds, and Alexander closed the distance between them with a measured pace. His usual confidence still present, but now balanced with something more deliberate, something closer to intention than instinct. And when he spoke, his tone was different from the night before, not softer, not apologetic, but more direct in a way that carried weight, telling her that he had come to understand something, that what she had done was not luck or coincidence, and that he did not like leaving things unexplained. And Grace listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed but attentive, giving him the space to continue without offering anything in return yet. And he asked her to walk him through it again, not the surface solution but the thinking behind it, what she saw that others did not, why she chose that approach when others hesitated. And for a moment she considered the request, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was deciding whether it was worth giving. And then she responded, explaining that most people overcomplicate problems when they are afraid of being wrong, that they look for perfect answers instead of immediate ones, and that sometimes the fastest way to regain control is to act on what is clear instead of waiting for what is certain. Her words simple but precise, reflecting a perspective shaped by experience rather than theory. And as she spoke, Alexander listened in a way he rarely did, not interrupting, not redirecting, just absorbing, because what she was describing challenged the foundation of how he operated, not completely, but enough to create tension between what he believed and what he was beginning to see. And when she finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that follows something important, and he realized that this was not just about a single situation anymore. It was about a different way of seeing control, one that did not rely on distance or hierarchy, and that realization brought with it something unfamiliar, a sense that he had been overlooking value simply because it did not fit his expectations. And as the moment settled, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days ago, offering her something without framing it as a command or an assumption, asking if she would be willing to step into a different role, not as a worker moving quietly in the background, but as someone whose perspective could be used where it mattered. And the question hung there between them, carrying more weight than he intended, because it was not just an offer, it was an acknowledgement of a shift he could no longer ignore. And Grace did not answer immediately, her eyes steady on him as if measuring not the opportunity itself but the meaning behind it, because she understood something he was only beginning to learn, that value is not defined by where it is placed. And as the silence stretched just a little longer, it became clear that whatever she chose next would not follow the expectations he was used to. And for the first time, Alexander Hayes was not in control of what came next. Grace did not respond right away, and the silence between them carried more weight than any immediate answer could, because this was not a moment she had been waiting for, not a door she had been trying to open, and that made her position stronger than Alexander Hayes had anticipated, as she looked at him not with hesitation but with clarity, understanding exactly what his offer represented and what it did not. And after a few seconds, she finally spoke, her voice calm but firm, telling him that a different role does not change how people see you unless they are willing to change first. And the words landed in a way that felt more direct than anything he had heard in a long time, because they were not shaped to impress him, they were shaped by truth. And for a moment he did not answer, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized something in what she said that he could not dismiss, that what he was offering might solve his curiosity, but not the imbalance that had created the situation in the first place. And as that realization settled, he did something that would have been unthinkable just days ago. He acknowledged it without deflecting, without turning it into strategy, simply admitting that he had been wrong about her, not in a dramatic way, not for effect, but in a controlled, deliberate tone that carried more meaning because it was not easy for him to say. And Grace watched him carefully, not impressed by the words alone, but by the way he chose them, because she understood that real change does not come from statements, it comes from what follows. And instead of accepting or rejecting his offer, she shifted the focus, asking him a question that placed the decision back in his hands, asking what exactly he was willing to change, not for her, but in the way he operated, in the way he saw the people who worked around him every day. And the question stayed in the air longer than expected, because it was not one he could answer quickly, not without confronting something deeper than a single mistake. And for the first time In the conversation, Alexander Hayes did not have an immediate response, his usual certainty replaced by a pause that revealed the complexity of what she was asking. And in that pause, something important happened, something that could not be undone, because instead of forcing an answer, he allowed himself to consider it fully, to recognize that the system he had built was effective but not complete, that it had strengths but also blind spots he had chosen not to see. And when he finally spoke, again, his voice carried a different weight, not just authority but intention, telling her that he did not have the full answer yet, but that he was willing to find it, not by replacing one role with another, but by changing how he understood value itself. And this time Grace did not challenge the statement. She simply nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that he had taken the first step in a direction that could not be reversed easily. And with that she made her decision, not accepting the offer as it was, but not rejecting it either, telling him that if he wanted her perspective, he would have to earn it over time, not through position but through consistency, through actions that proved he meant what he said. And then, without waiting for his reaction, she picked up her bag again, turning to leave just as she had the night before, but this time the distance between them felt different, not defined by status, but by something more uncertain, something still forming. And as she walked away, Alexander did not stop her. He did not try to change her mind in that moment, because he understood now that control was not about holding on, it was about what you did when you did not have it. And as he stood there watching her leave, he realized that the woman he once dismissed had not only changed the outcome of a single situation, she had changed the way he would approach everything that came after. And for the first time in a long time, the future he was stepping into was not one he had already planned, but one he would have to learn to navigate differently.